HRP and FDA, Office of Human Research Protections, which is out of the Department of Health and Human Services, and the FDA. We as an institution have to report to those entities if certain compliance issues are identified. So if there is serious noncompliance, continuing noncompliance, serious or continuing noncompliance, or unanticipated problem involving risk to subjects or others, or a suspension or termination of IRB approval related to a study, and it's federally funded, we are obligated as an institution to report it to OHRP. And when we report, we also, as an institution, have to work with the investigator to identify corrective actions and report those to FDA also. So all these entities are responsible for the oversight of a study. So what is quality management? This is a topic which was introduced onto the campus probably in 2000, 2001. And unfortunately, or fortunately, this topic was brought forth as something that needed to be done for research based on some serious adverse events that happened on this campus. I used to be the compliance officer over at the VA and implemented their quality improvement program back in 2000, 2001. And then Susan Buskirk, who is now an assistant vice president here at UMB, implemented this program on the UMB side of things. And we've worked together over the years to make sure that this type of program is implemented across the campus and is providing education and training to different entities across the campus. So what is a quality management program? It's defined as a plan or system including structure and defined responsibilities, which provides a framework for all quality management activities, including quality control, quality assurance, quality improvement, and the reporting of these activities. We're going to break down all these different terms so you know what they mean, how they're implemented, and then how things get reported. One of the principles of good clinical practices, which is related to QA, is that the principles of ICH-GCP is that there should be systems with procedures that ensure the quality of every aspect of the trial. Now, what do we mean by good clinical practices? ICH means International Council on Harmonization, GCP. What does that mean? Studies that are conducted here at UMB need to follow the principles of GCP. The principles of GCP can be found in the investigator manual as one of the appendices. Sponsors do research domestically and internationally. And there are many different levels of regulations that have to be followed. Europe has different sets of regulations, Canada, United States. ICH is global. So when a sponsor says, we're going to conduct a study based on ICH GCP, they know that there's a level of oversight and a level, the study's being conducted to a certain standard. So they can look at some consistency in the reporting across the world. And then entities like the FDA would then accept the findings of the studies. So that's why GCP is extremely important in terms of, and GCP is not just for industry-sponsored studies. Investigators should be following GCP for non-industry sponsored studies also. So in terms of ICH GCP, what's the responsibility of the investigator? They need to ensure the accuracy, completeness, legibility, and timeliness of the data that's reported to the sponsor in the CRFs and in all required reports. So we know what accuracy means, we know what completeness means, legibility, you've got to be able to read it, and then timeliness. What do we mean by timeliness? Well, for example, the subject signs the consent form, witness might sign the consent form, and then the investigator signs it 6 months later. That's not timeliness. The investigator is supposed to sign the eligibility criteria before participants enrolled in the study. They shouldn't be signing it 6 months later. They need to be signing it on the day the participant is enrolled. That's what we mean by timeliness. As I said before, the principal investigator is ultimately responsible for all study-related activities. That means they're also responsible for what the study staff does. That's why weekly team meetings and keeping in contact with people who are on your study team is extremely important so that you know what's going on in the study. So what are the goals of quality management? We need to ensure adequate protection of human research participants. That's the most important part. Improve the quality of study conduct. Improve quality and scientific validity of collected data and increase compliance with regulatory requirements. Improve documentation practices. Ensure the adequacy of informed consent. Provide early identification of problems and provide process improvement. There's nothing worse than getting to the end of the study and deciding, oh, let's look back and, we're going to publish a manuscript now. Let's take a look at the data, and then you identify all these problems. If you have all these holes in the data, you haven't collected all the data you thought you were going to collect, how are you going to write up your manuscript? And this leads to identification of areas where education and training efforts are needed. So how is this accomplished? If you were starting out and saying, how am I going to do this? How would I ever do this in my research program? First place to start is to use this tool, which was in the back. It's available on our website. It's called an Investigator Quality Improvement Assessment Tool. Now, when you look at this tool, very comprehensive. It's very comprehensive because this might be for a clinical trial, and although may not be conducting research involving a clinical trial, there's still other portions of this tool which can be used. So, you might start with, how do I know I have all the regulatory documentation I need to have for a study? So that's the regulatory documentation. How do I know I've documented or retained all the documents I need to retain? How do I look at my study records? Now, this can be used, and then you go to the back, and it would be if you were a clinical investigator with an industry sponsor, or you were the sponsor, you might fill out that portion. And then here is a document. You can make multiple copies of it, and then you use it to go through each individual patient that you have enrolled in your study. So this would be a good place to start. And if you're a member of a study team, you might divide this up and say, okay, why don't you take a look at the regulatory binder? Why don't you take a look at, the first patient enrolled and the third patient that's enrolled? Start small. Because if you try to do it any bigger than that, you'll get overwhelmed. You look at what you find, and then you say, things look pretty good, or we have a couple of problems we need to identify. It's good to do this early in a study, because as I said, identify the problem early, fix the problem early, and then you don't repeat yourself and repeat the problem. Because if you have the same problem, let's just say you use the wrong version of the consent form the entire time in the study. You now have to report that to the IRB as noncompliance because you're the investigator. And you have to come up with a corrective action plan. And you have to say to the IRB, yes, I used the wrong version of a consent form, but the information may have been all included in the wrong version, or it may not have been. And then you're compromising your ability to potentially use that data, because the IRB is going to look at it and say, how much noncompliance was there? And is there data integrity? Or has it all been compromised? And has the rights of safety and welfare of participants been compromised? And many people think that, oh, it's just minimal risk research, what's the risk? I'm not giving the patient a drug. I'm not giving the patient a device. I'm not, doing anything risky. But if surveys aren't administered appropriately, if wrong versions of consent forms are not administered appropriately, if you've got incomplete data, if you've got multiple deviations, take that all together, you might not have a very robust study. Teamwork. The investigator isn't doing this in a vacuum, and the study team isn't doing it in a vacuum. Everyone has to play their part. Communication. You got to look, and then you have to communicate. You have to, if there's findings, you have to communicate it to a team. And it may be something that gets talked about in a staff meeting, or at a higher level. Because if there's one entity that's having little problems, I can guarantee you all the other entities are having little problems too. And education. Because if you find something, you need to educate people on how to improve and how to correct it. Because if not, if people don't know that they're doing something wrong, they'll just keep doing it, right? So if you educate, and then you help prevent, and then when you do the next study, hopefully you're not making the same mistake. So define responsibilities. So you have a research team and you say, well, the PI is ultimately responsible. We have a study coordinator, and maybe we have some research assistants. The thing is, with some of the smaller teams, you don't really want to have the same person who's doing the work checking the work, because you might miss it twice. So you might have to do some cross, like, oh, I'll help your team with QA if you help mine. And no, you don't have to be on each other's research teams if you're doing that. Because if you have defined responsibility, it's I'm helping this team with QA and they're helping me. Reporting. Here's something that's key. You may find something pretty serious, or you may find nothing. If you find something that's serious that meets the reporting requirements as outlined by the IRB, or your sponsor for that matter, you have to report it. And identify a corrective action plan, and then education. Again, that word education keeps coming up again and again and again. So there's some different terms that we use. And one thing I want to say, I'm up here talking about QA, QC, and how it relates to quality, research. I'm going to show you what we do in the IRB. So I'm just not up here preaching about what everyone outside the IRB should be doing and everyone outside of the HRPP should be doing. We're doing the same thing internally. So we've implemented and have a quality control plan, quality management plan internally for what we do, and then this is what we recommend for research teams. So what is quality control? So quality control is something you do in real time. It's a systemic check of protocol adherence and regulatory adherence. And I'm going to give you some examples of what that means. So how could you do quality control for clinical research? You're doing the informed consent process. You give the consent form to the study team, to the participant. They sign it, they date it, you sign it, you date it. Then you might say to somebody, hey, can you do a quick QC check on this? Make sure the date's right. January hits, everyone's still putting the previous year on things. Now, you find a mistake with a consent form, what do? You don't throw it out. You don't rip it up. Ever, ever, ever. You can correct a mistake, just like you learned in nursing school. You put one line through it, you make the correction, and you initial it. You don't obliterate, and you never, ever, ever use whiteout. Ever. It's not about documents looking pretty. You have to be able to see what you were correcting. Another real-time check would be you have an individual and you're looking at inclusion-exclusion criteria. And your criteria might be, I'm using nursing students who are sophomores, and they all need to be over the age of 18. Maybe we'll use freshmen. Sometimes kids come into college and they're not 18 yet. If you're under the age of 18, you're considered a child, even if you're in college. So you want to enroll 18-year-olds, freshmen in nursing school, and they're taking anatomy and physiology, and you want them to fill out a survey on something. So you've got 4 criteria there. Someone fills in their demographic and fills in their date of birth. And you're like, oh yeah, they're 18. They were born in the right year. Well, what about the date and the month? They might be a child. You enroll them in the study. That protocol hasn't been enrolled or hasn't been reviewed to enroll children. They're considered a vulnerable population by the federal government. So you've just enrolled somebody. So you're reviewing the inclusion criteria. You think somebody is eligible for the study. You could hand that eligibility criteria to somebody and say, hey, can you double check this for me before I do any study procedures? And they say, oh, this person's not 18 yet. So yes, they've signed a consent form. Yes, that's non-compliance. But you identified it before you did any study procedures. Yes, you would need to report that to the IRB, but at least you didn't move forward in the process. So that's a QC check. Now again, that might have gotten caught during the informed consent process. So that's what we mean by real time. What does this mean in terms of the IRB? We QC every set of IRB meeting minutes before anybody gets issued a determination letter. And for those of you who are investigators, you know what that means. We have 12 IRB meetings a month. We operate more as like a commercial IRB than an academic IRB. Most academic centers, they have a couple of meetings a month. We have 12 a month. We QC every set of IRB meeting minutes before a letter of determination is issued to make sure that we're in regulatory compliance, because we have all types of regulations we have to adhere to. So QC is in real time. We also QC IRB determination letters, particularly when we're orienting new staff, to make sure that what's going into the letter is correct, it looks correct, the formatting and all that. So we do QC there. And I'm going to show you what our QC plan is a little bit further down the line in terms of what we do in our office. So you can come up with a plan of what you're going to do internally if you want. QA is interval auditing. So QC might be 100% of an item. So we do 100% of IRB meeting minutes. But we might say, we're going to do 10% of, we're going to review 10% of every protocol that enrolled children on this campus. So we would query our database and identify every protocol that enrolled children and say, okay, we want to make sure that the regulations were adhered to. That's what we're going to do QA on. So there might be 150 studies, and of those 150, we're going to take 10%. So we're looking at, it's a smaller subset of something to see if we have an issue there. I mean, you can identify an issue in QA, and if you look at 10% and you have problems in 10%, then you might have to do 100%. Just depends. So that's interval auditing. We do the same thing, we've done the same thing on campus when we've done investigator audits. We'll say, we want to look and see where the high-risk drug and device studies are being done. And we'll identify the studies, identify the investigator, and we're going to do 10% of studies on campus that involve an invasive device. So from that standpoint, we're doing QA of investigator studies. Quality improvement is QA and QC. And there's been all kinds of terms that you've heard over the years. CQI and TQM and continuous quality improvement, total quality management, and this, it's all the same. However you slice and dice it, however you write your plan, whatever the buzzword of the day is, when you get right down to it, this is what the activity is. And let me tell you something. You're going to find stuff. I mean, even when the IRB gets audited, we've been audited 11 times in 10 years. And we're talking federal oversight agencies. They find little things. What you don't want is you don't want systemic breakdown. You have systemic breakdown. That means nobody's looking and nobody's paying attention. If you're paying attention, you will find little things, but if you have a plan to correct it, that's the most important thing. It is the most important thing. I mean, QC, I take QC and I look at it, it's the same thing that they used to do, and they probably still do in operating rooms. I was never an OR nurse, but okay, are we operating on the right leg? Are we operating on the right eye? You got two people confirming that you got the right patient. You're looking at the wristband. Yes, this is Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones, you're here to have your eye operated on today. Which eye is it? My right eye. Or my right eye. No, that's not. So that type. So it's like taking a timeout. You take a timeout. You make sure you've got the right patient, the right procedures, right consent form. It's no different than giving a medication when you're on the floor. You're doing a procedure. Do you have the right patient? Are you doing the right procedure on the patient? Taking the time out is a lot easier than filling out all the paperwork later if something goes wrong. So, operational techniques, quality control, and activities undertaken within a QA system to verify that the requirements for quality of trial-related activities have been fulfilled. Again, a GCP requirement. And when I talk about a plan, I'm not talking about, an SOP that's 44 pages long and this and that and this and that. The broader something is, the greater the chances are it's going to be adhered to. So, for example, if the School of Nursing said, we're going to look at 10% of new studies that get approved, and we're going to look at them 3 months after they're approved, and we're going to look at informed consents and eligibility. Boom, done. That's your plan. Because there's nothing worse than having a plan or an SOP, and then you're not adhering to it. So, systematic checks of compliance, we talked about this, can be performed at every step of the research process. They're ongoing and they're concurrent. You're assuring adherence to the approved protocol and protocol procedures. And there's documentation. So if you say you're going to do it, keep documentation. It can be performed by members of the research team, again, depending on your size. Ideally, it's 100% chart review. Collaboration between staff, so you can get a second set of eyes on something. And it's real-time correction of deficiencies. Again, instead of waiting until after you've enrolled 10 patients, and then you're like, oh, well, we've done it wrong 10 times. Instead of doing it wrong once, or a portion of something wrong once. So what can you look at? Informed consent documents, very important. Inclusion and exclusion criteria verification. I have a little bit of a cold, I'm sorry. Completed source documentation and CRFs. Study procedure records and worksheets. I mean, this all goes to your data integrity. And you want to be able to publish this information. Study drug and concomitant med records. Again, only if you're doing drug studies. Specimen collection and laboratory results. So if you're drawing a sample of blood and realize, we've been drawing blood and it never gets to the lab in time. So all your lab results are compromised. What happens to your study? You really don't have one if that was one of your outcomes or your objectives or had anything to do with your hypothesis. Or if you're having blood drawn and you have to put it and ship it and you get a call from FedEx that says, oops, sorry, it didn't get delivered, or there was no dry ice left in the box when it got delivered. Now, yes, some things are out of your control, but how do you correct things? Drug accountability and management, extremely important when you're doing drug studies. Safety and efficacy documentation. Again, very important. You're doing drug studies and patients are coming in for safety visits because they've been taking a medication for a certain amount of time. Deviations and adverse event reporting. So these are all things that you can look at. If you were doing quality of life questionnaires or you're doing some type of survey, you could look at all the surveys and say, oh, I need to look at these to make sure people are filling them out correctly. That might be good to do, particularly if you're drafting your own tools. For those of you who have ever developed your own questionnaires, it's a good way to make sure that people are filling out and understanding the questions correctly. Because if the way the questions are being asked and the way they're being answered is incorrect, it's going to compromise your data. So you can use a quality control checklist for informed consent documentation and an inclusion-exclusion criteria. You can turn your inclusion-exclusion criteria checklist into a quality control checklist and just use that. You don't have to create, it doesn't have to create a lot more work for you. Use the tools that you already have for your study, and then just, as we used to do when I was doing clinical research, we'd print them on a different color paper. They might be purple, they might be green. Then you can use that as your documentation. And then you know that it's been done for the study. So QA is all those planned and systematic actions that are established to ensure that the trial is performed and the data are generated, documented, and reported in compliance with GCP and applicable regulatory requirements. So it's your plan. What is the plan? So as I said, QA is validating, is QC working correctly? You have to prioritize. Basically, you got to do a risk assessment. When someone says to me, well, how do I know where to look? There's so many places we need to look. How do I know where to look first? Well, you got to look at your portfolio and say, well, I've got this type of research going on. We got this type of research going on. Where's our biggest risk? Is it the student research? Is it, DMP students doing projects? Is it, if you're someone who's doing high-risk drug and device studies, is it that type? If you're doing research involving children, is it there? Are you doing research with cognitively impaired individuals? Those of you who go to nursing homes, extremely important. Those of you who might do prisoner research. QA is done retrospectively, so everything's already been done. You're just doing a check. And again, what's your sample size? It's got to be realistic. If you have 20 people in your study, you might say, well, 10% is 2. Not really going to give me anything. Maybe I need 25. And again, what do you want to look at? Same thing with QC. Protocol adherence, informed consent documentation. Clinical endpoints. Has anybody met a clinical endpoint? How many patients had to stop treatment? Why? What's going on? Your regulatory documents. Now, everything's in Cicero. We don't require, the IRB doesn't require that you print everything off and put it in a regulatory binder. Your sponsor may require you to have stuff in the regulatory binder. But all the regulatory documents would be in Cicero. For those of you who are doing like industry-sponsored studies, you need to compare source documentations to case report forms. Source documentation is where you're writing down the information that you're collecting. Case report forms is when information's been transcribed from the source to the case, and then a monitor comes from a sponsor to double check the accuracy. And if it's correct, they usually pull off a copy of it, because it's, in multiple copies. And then documentation practices. You can take a look at that and say, how often is the PI, reviewing eligibility? Are they doing it in real time? Are we documenting things appropriately? Are we making a lot of mistakes? Are we correcting mistakes correctly? So how are things being done that way? This is a tool we have on our website. You can use it if you want. This is just looking in, and again, you could take this, you could print it on a purple piece of paper, and you can use it to look at a record. So what was the date of the visit for the participant? What's the Cicero number? What's the subject ID? The date the audit was done? Who did it? And then what are you looking at? So you're verifying the following for patients. All source docs are signed and dated. Entries are in black ink. There's nothing blank. Everything's legible. There's no whiteout. Errors are corrected correctly. And all of this. And then if there's a deficiency, what was the deficiency based on the number? What page number was it? Any details? Who's the responsible clinician, and when was it corrected? You can leave this right in the front of a chart. And then that's why you put it in a different color. And then somebody notices, oh, something's wrong, something needs to be corrected. Or if it's consent, was there a problem with the consent form? So, again, if you're doing QA, you're going to find something. Some deficiency, a problem, could be very minor. But now what do you do about it? So communication, this is important. Communication of activities and findings. So you find that there's been issues. That previous form is for an individual study. What you might want to then do is tabulate it based on the study and come up with, overall, here are the issues that we had with the study. Then you want to communicate the findings to the team members, the clinical staff, and the investigator. Start with the investigator and say, here's the issues we've identified. Here's what I think is a good corrective action plan. Develop a plan, implement that plan, stick to the plan. That's another thing. Don't come up with some robust, overly robust plan that you can't adhere to. The IRB sees that sometimes, and the investigator literally goes overboard to say, I'm going to do this, and this, and I'm going to do all kinds of stuff. And then the IRB looks at it and says, there is no way they are going to be able to do this. Or the investigator says, I'm going to do this plan. The IRB says, okay, we approve that plan. And then they don't stick to it. Well, that's a problem too. Because if you're telling the IRB you're doing something, you need to stick with it. Learn from the deficiencies and educate. And if your study team involves students, you need to involve them. The other thing you might want to look at is, let's just say, you might want to do a little QA on what are your advertisements? How are you recruiting people into studies? That's just a thought. So corrective actions have to be achievable and verifiable. The IRB could say, okay, you said you're going to do this corrective action plan. We're going to come out and take a look at your study in 6 months. And whoever the auditor is going to come out and see, well, can we verify that they implemented the corrective action plan? The other thing is who's the person responsible for the corrective action plan? It might be the investigator. They're the one who's ultimately responsible, but it might be a study team member. And then what's the time frame for corrective action plan implementation? You can't say, well, I'm going to make sure everything's done within 9 months. No, it's usually probably about a month. Particularly if you have to do training and education, if you find a systemic problem. So errors and problems will be identified. Knowing mistakes made in the past can help prevent making the same mistake in the future. And identifying problem areas helps to identify areas of educational needs. Quality improvement is continuous. You're evaluating, you're educating, and then you're coming up with what's the best practices. Because you start a study, you think, oh, I'm going to do this and this and this. And then you implement some QA and you say, no, we need to really look at some best practices and how we're doing things. Come up with some best practices. The other thing is before you even start a study, what type of QA can you do? Well, you can look at qualifications of the investigator and the research staff. So you're going to be, somebody gets a grant. Grant's going to be a multi-year grant. You're going to have different people working on it. You got to pull all this information together. Well, why don't you start with looking at the qualifications of the investigator and the research staff? Where's all the CVs? Where's everybody's license? Everybody have an active license? That type of thing. Looking at the IRB submission. Now, you probably, School of Nursing has a process for departmental review. So that's looking at the quality of the submission. But you might want to have some eyes looking at submissions even prior to departmental review. You want to look at site facilities versus protocol requirements. So what are the resources that you're going to need to conduct a study? Do you have the clinic space? Do you have access to enough students? Do you have access to the patient population you need in order to conduct the study? You want to look at the protocol versus the informed consent, again done prior to at departmental review, but you want to make sure investigators, you have a protocol, it's everything that needs to be in the consent form based on how the protocol is written. And then again, looking at protocol versus case report forms or data collection instruments. Again, prior to ever starting the study. It's kind of like doing a dry run before you even start. Back when I was doing vaccine research, before we'd start a protocol, we'd have a dry run of how the whole enrollment period was going to work. So we knew we would be recruiting patients. We might have 5 patients coming in a day. Well, how do you know those 5 patients are having everything done that they need to have done, and they're having it done smoothly? So we'd do a dry run before we'd start a study, and we'd say, okay, this is where we're going to do informed consent. And we might be doing informed consent in a room with a whole group of people, completely appropriate, depending on what your patient population is. And then we realized, well, what if patients have sensitive information they want to tell us? Well, they're not going to talk about it in that. So we had to have a clinic room where we could take a patient to say, you have additional questions, let's talk about it. Then somebody was doing H&Ps. We had to have a clinic room for that. Then somebody was having blood drawn. They had to be in a room where they could have blood drawn. Then they had to have a room where they could wait before they could be vaccinated potentially. So we had to have a waiting area. And then we had to have a vaccine area. And then we had to have an area where somebody could sit after they had the vaccination to make sure they don't have a reaction. So we're looking at our site facilities and what the protocol said, and could we do all this? Because if you're trying to do a mass vaccination, you got to have space. So during the study, and we talked a little bit about this, source documentation, regulatory IRB correspondence, sponsor correspondence, adverse events, unanticipated problems. You can do QA on all of that. Now, the study's over. You can still do some QA. You can do database review. You can make sure you have the right number of case report forms versus the number of patients you enrolled. Do you have all the clinical study reports? Do you have all the SAEs? Have you submitted a final report? Do you have all your documentation from your sponsor or your project manager or your project officer or whoever, whatever the term is? Again, here's what we do for QA, QC in our office. So it's a pretty simple looking plan. So basically we identify what we're going to do. So QA and QC activities, here's the indicators, who's responsible, and then we would put in a month and a year. So number 1, there's a director at all IRB meetings. That's how we catch a lot of stuff. because there's somebody there who can provide regulatory guidance if a conversation's going down the wrong path, or I won't say the wrong path, but if they need guidance to make sure that they're making the right determinations. Then QC, pre-review of informed consent documents. So investigators submit an informed consent document draft. We might do QC to make sure all the elements of informed consent are in there. If you look in here on the back of page 2, it tells you what the required elements of informed consent are. These are regulatory requirements. These aren't institutional. This is the federal government saying, here's the regulatory requirements for an informed consent document. And then there's more of them based on who your sponsor is. VA, FDA, DOJ, DOE, DOD, all kinds of. So we might look at informed consent documents. Again, we're calling that QC, although we're only looking at 10% because sometimes we just have too many transactions. I mean, there's almost 2,100 active protocols on the campus. It's a lot of research. And we probably review 45 transactions a week at a full board meeting, and then probably double that for non-committee review. So we do QC, IRB meeting minutes. Who's the responsible individual? So for responsible individual, a director at all meetings, that's me. QC of informed consent documents might be one of our coordinators. IRB meeting minutes, QC, is going to be our administrators. And I'm not putting a person's name in there because we have 11 people who work in the office. I'm putting a title in there. It might be different for you all. QC of IRB letters of determination is going to be the administrators, because that's the person who's helping to orient the new staff. Modifications required to secure approval. We're confirming that the investigator's doing what they say they're going to do. The responsible individual would be an administrator or a coordinator. So this would be for full board review. This is for non-committee review, because we have individuals in the office who process expedited transactions. Reportable new information determination letters that go to the full board. We might do 100%. We might look at pre-reviews for the convened IRB. Again, that would be our office staff. Then we might do a subset of exempt and expedited transactions to make sure we're doing what we're supposed to do there. Look at full committee reviews. The other thing we look at, and we look at some of these, we might look at contracts out of ORD. There's regulatory, we're an accredited program by the Association for the Accreditation of Human Research Protection Programs, and there is required language that has to be in contracts. So we would look at the last 10 contracts that got signed out of ORD to make sure the language is in there. We might go and do a spot audit of the Investigational Drug Service to make sure that they are documenting things appropriately. Emergency use of a test article in a life-threatening situation. That's a mechanism where a physician, not an investigator, a physician can use a test article when a patient's in a life-threatening situation. In other words, they have no other options left, and they want to use a certain device or a certain test article. We would QC those. And then waivers of informed consent. So these are the big ticket items, so to speak. So we've prioritized. This is how we prioritize internally. And then when we find things, we bring them back to the team to say, for example, we're doing the IRB meeting minutes. There's a difference between a protocol getting deferred and a protocol where it's modifications required to secure approval. There's a difference. There's a regulatory difference. If the IRB is making the wrong determination, a regulatory oversight agency, if they saw the minutes, would say you're not doing it right. So we go back and educate the staff on what that means, and we also educate the IRB members. So all of these things are things we've looked at in our office over the years. and we've implemented corrective actions. So there's a lot here, but it's not a huge plan. And the tools that we use to collect the information is based on templates and tools that the individuals use to do their job to begin with. And we just turn them into QC tools. So quality management activities often identify issues. You need to devise and implement corrective actions and educate. I mean, having this type of plan, we implemented, at least on the campus, we implemented QA before it was mandated to implement it. Because as an accredited program, we have to have an auditing and monitoring program. So we had already ironed out all the kinks before we became accredited. And then it's extremely important to keep records. You know, here's what we did, here's the summary, here's how we re-educated and trained. Here's the sign-in sheet, very important, sign-in sheets. Who attended, who was trained. So the goal was protection of participants. Strengthens credibility, it's a team effort, it's continuous education is vital. That is the checklist reference that you have. It's on our website, it's in our toolkit. Questions?
Well, thank you, Julie. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.